When days walk by inches, continuity can feel like anesthesia. No drama, only competence. As it was, trimmed, taught to behave.
Wardrobe and imitation. Comfort tailored. Reflections trained to keep you calm.
A light like a person. Some names refuse to sleep.
I'll guide. You rest. Let their harmonies pass like weather.
Breathe slowly. Keep your own time. Do not stop asking. Let memory return.
For the next 2 hours, you won't need to chase sleep.
Not outrage. Not spectacle. Patient attention.
Before we begin, take a slow breath. Let the room grow quiet and let the day fall behind you. If a good story helps you rest, you're in the right place. Tonight's file is titled Forbidden Vatican Secrets, The Shadow Crusade, and the Legion of Silver Cloaks. Settle in. I am speaking in a register I was trained never to use. Not the warm cadence for catechisms, not the polished syllables for homilies, but the unsteady gear of a voice that has been kept in a cupboard for years and only now is brought out, dusty and blinking. I was a priest once. No photographs, no parish bulletins, no smiling children in a nave of sun. I belong to corridors that have no windows, to rooms where the air tastes like candle soot and old ink, to a vocabulary that prefers the verb to correct over the verb to confess. If you are still here, slow your breathing. Put your phone face down. Let the room unspool into a quiet you can hear. They used to tell us that silence is a sacrament, that silence is where the holy lives. Later I learned their version. Silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. That lesson arrived on the same night the door opened, the door that wasn't meant to open. Not for me, not yet. Perhaps not for anyone, not already past saving. A key clicked like a knuckle against a wooden coffin. A bolt slid with the self-importance of a thing unused, and the hinge exhaled the breath of centuries. I would like to tell you that I hesitated then, that I suspected a threshold should be treated like a person, greeted, asked permission, offered a reason. I did not hesitate. Some openings are more gravity than choice. The corridor down to the door is spiral, as though the stone were poured around a single dark thought and allowed to harden. I remember the temperature dropping the way a choir lowers its pitch. A degree with each turn, a semitone with each step. Lamps burned behind thick glass, in brackets, shaped like angel wings, too sharp, too clean, burnished by hands that prefer metal to flesh. Somewhere unseen, water ran. Not a stream, not a leak. The thin, continuous sound of a clock that has forgotten to form ticks, and so becomes a river. The first time a silver cloak took my papers, I noticed he didn't look at the seal, only at my face, like a craftsman measuring a piece of wood before deciding which saw would do. There were no insignia on him, no mark of rank, only the delicate dusting of graphite rubbed into the fabric, a dullness that somehow made the cloak gleam more in the dark. He passed the folio back and said, in the tone of a ledger stating a sum, Archive of Corrections. Room 9. I felt my name lighten in my skull, as if letters could evaporate. I tell you this now with the steadiness of a metronome, because I need you to understand how ordinary it felt. There is a cruelty in the way the extraordinary arranges itself to look like office work. I stood in room 9, a table, 2 chairs, a wall of drawers, and inhaled that smell I will never be able to fully describe. People call it parchment, or dust, or old glue. They are wrong. It smells like the distant memory of blood learning to be paper. It smells like skin that wants to remain a boundary and is asked, instead, to become an archive. On the table waited an object I would later dream about, long after I left. A star map drawn in crushed lapis and gold leaf so thin it made my eyes ache. The blue was not a color but an event. The gold didn't shine so much as hum. In the top right margin, in a hand small enough to be a secret, someone had written, Porta apriatur ad ortum signi angeli. A gate will open at the rising of the angel's sign. The note had been underlined once. The underline had been sanded nearly away. Intention leaves bruises, even on vellum. They trained us to translate, but that is not the work. They trained us to reconcile, but that is not the work either. The work is persuasion, the kind that begins with yourself. I learned to copy a line so faithfully the original believed it had made a mistake. I learned which contradictions to rename as variant traditions, which scandalous parts of the record to baptize as exaggerations of piety, which women to tilt out of the light by tilting the light itself. I learned to praise someone so loudly in the wrong century that he evaporated from the one in which he was genuine. There is a catechism of forgetting. I did not know it had a catechism. The woman who taught me wore the cloak like a negative of moonlight, a brightness that refused to behave. Her face was the true mastery, not anonymous, no. Anonymity calls attention to itself, but terminally familiar, as if you'd seen her in 100 stations and could not recall which. She said, "A story is a hallway. Our work is to decide which doors it is allowed to pass." She placed a key on the desk between us. It was warm. Keys are never warm unless they belong to the living. Below the archive proper, there are rooms we don't name. I do not mean this poetically. The maps terminate. The stairwell curves as if cleverness were a geometry. The walls perspire. Strings of condensation bead and roll and bead again. It is there, among bones that have turned patient and stones that have learned the taste of prayer, that I first heard the phrase Cruciata Umbrarum, Shadow Crusade, a title for an army without banners and a war without horizons. No drums, no standard bearers. Their victories are measured in the number of versions that do not survive. I will tell you how the indoctrination works, but I will not dramatize it. That is their trick. They escort you past the expensive relics, the jeweled cases, the reliquaries that look like cities, and sit you in front of a book that is simply chained, not caged, not locked, merely prevented from forgetting where it belongs. You are told that chain means stability, that in a shifting world, you need points that do not move, that the book is a peg for reality. You will want to agree. You will think of storms and tent ropes and the dignity of fastening what would otherwise fly apart. This is how you begin. After that, small tasks. A saint's day realigned by 13 sunrise minutes to harmonize with a new calendar. A letter gently nudged from one pontiff to his successor for continuity. A map annotated in a marginal hand to clarify that this coastline is allegory, that that island is metaphor, that the cartographer was pious but misguided. You will sense the world shift, almost like a ship at anchor turning on a tide that has subtly changed direction. You will also sense the relief of watchers who prefer a horizon where they left it. It's important that you know I believed. Belief is not only a property of religion. Bureaucracy also offers a creed. It comes with the smell of paper cuts and tea that has gone cold because you were concentrating on aligning the footnotes. It comes with supervisors who praise your exactitude the way choir masters praise a boy who can hold a note until his lungs ache. It comes with the charitable notion that you are sparing children confusion. It comes with the darker notion that confusion breeds heresy, and heresy makes fire. I believed until the night the door opened the wrong way. Doors are machines for direction. Hinges are little sermons about how the world is meant to pivot. This door had always swung inward. I know because I had opened it, respectfully, carefully. With that gesture of the wrist we are taught to cultivate, so the metal believes we are trustworthy. On this night I reached, and the handle turned like a wrist that wishes to be free, and the door swung toward me like an accusation. The room was a theater, the kind of space where truth is not so much displayed as staged. There were listening stations booths with velvet that remembered other people's backs. There was a lectern polished to a low sorrow by confessions. And on the far wall, 7 clocks. I cannot explain why the clocks made me afraid. They were not ornate. They did not chime. They spoke in small disagreements, one a minute ahead, one 2 minutes slow, one that seemed to gain and lose half a second every few breaths, as if mimicking the human heart. If you have ever heard a choir sing adjacent notes and felt your bones try to choose which tone to become, you understand the sound the clocks made. A man waited for me there. You would not know his face, though you have seen his decisions. He had the kind of posture a sword might adopt if it wanted to be discreet. He slid a file toward me. Inside was my handwriting, familiar and foreign. My adjudication of a saint whose name I will not speak here because I still fear waking him. In the margin I had written, months ago, in the coaxing voice of a gardener, "We will remove him softly by praising him in the wrong century." The sentence did not blush. Paper does not blush. But the room felt warmer all the same. He tapped the page with 2 fingers, like a metronome setting a tempo for my conscience. "Do you know why we built the archive?" he asked. "To protect truth," I said, "the way you answer when you are fluent in answers." He tilted his head, as if listening to a rehearsal in another room. "To protect memory," he said. "Truth is turbulent. Memory is useful. Nations are made of it." He let the silence collect like rain in a cistern. Then he added, almost kindly, "So are churches." We stood, I think, for a long time in the company of those clocks. I tried to align my breathing to one of them. It is difficult to synchronize the body to disagreement. He walked me past a glass case containing a sword I had never seen, though I now suspect it had often stood near me without announcing itself. The sword had never drawn blood. They say it belonged to an angel who found a different war. The scabbard smelled like frankincense and wood polish, and something I cannot name because there is no word for childhood church at dusk after the door closes behind the last parishioner. He spoke about a program I had not been cleared to hear, mirrors trained to show different scenes depending on who approached, a museum that curdled into a catechism if a certain kind of believer stood before a painting. He said the word fail-safe and explained a choir taught to sing across frequencies that wrap events in forgetfulness, the way a shroud wraps a face, gentle and complete. He smiled when he said gentle. The smile did not reach any place useful. After he left, I listened to the clocks until I understood something I had not wanted to understand. Time is not a river. Time is an animal. It can be domesticated, but it will never be entirely tame. It will sleep at your feet because it is tired of arguing. It will also wake and bite. I returned to room 9 with the star map. The lapis hummed more audibly now, as if proximity to those clocks had tuned my hearing. The gold constellations were stitched like nerves across a sky that refused to be mere ornament. The marginal note, the angel's sign, had been crossed again. Not erased, crossed. Erasure is a claim. Crossing is a negotiation. I pressed my thumb to the vellum and felt the faint give of skin disguised as history. There are kinds of proximity that feel like prayer and are not. When the summons came after midnight below even the archive, I obeyed. Habit is a harness you learn to wear proudly. The air in the lower stairwell was wet and mineral. The guard barely glanced at me. The silver dust on his cloak made a comet behind him in the lamplight. In a room with no name, we performed a rite that did not announce itself as one. Papers were rearranged, as if rearrangement were a kind of housekeeping. A statue of an unremarked archangel, no trumpet, no spear, asked for our backs. At the third gesture, prescribed by the manual, the air thickened with iron and cold sugar. I tasted the memory of winter in a city I have never visited. A version of me peeled away like damp wallpaper. When we finished, the clocks upstairs agreed for exactly 1 minute. Then they disagreed, as if taught to take turns. I want to tell you, I ran then. The truth is that leaving begins not with footsteps, but with refusing to correct a small error. I miscopied a date. I let it stand. Nothing fell. No bells rang. No saints climbed off their plinths and scolded me for negligence. The world accepted the mistake the way a scar accepts sun, uncomfortably, but without speech. That is the moment, if I am honest, when I realized we had not invented the method we used. We had encoded it. We had trained a wild instrument to play behind stone. After that, the seams were all I could see. A poem quoting a line written decades later. A reliquary that gained a breath of weight every night. A map that hummed only when a certain monk's name was spoken in a dialect no one had used in 300 years. A saint who kept trying to be remembered by making everyone mispronounce him the same wrong way. Each anomaly was a hand on my sleeve saying, "We are not convinced." Each anomaly was also an invitation to lie better. When I passed the man from the theater in a corridor that smelled of starch and quiet, he did not look at me. I do not think this was disdain. I think it was the mercy of not making the decision yet. The cloak around my shoulders felt heavier than my bones. The key in my pocket felt like a small heartbeat. The lamphizings, shaped like wings, crooked their metal toward the steps. I do not remember looking back. I would like to have looked back, to have offered the corridor a polite farewell. I left in the most unheroic way imaginable. I kept walking when the script said stop. You will ask how I made it past the guard, who always reads the papers without reading them. The answer is that he was speaking to someone in a whisper that sounded almost like prayer, and he did not want to be interrupted by his other job. You will ask where I went. The answer is upstairs to a room I had been lent in a building that owns more rooms than it admits. I placed the key on the table, still warm, and watched the halo of heat fade into the wood. I packed nothing I could not carry in a pocket. I left the cloak on a chair. Without the graphite, the fabric looked indecently bright, a silver that chose to be ordinary only by effort. I closed the door after me with a gentleness that might have been affection, or might have been fear of waking something that had the right to sleep. Outside, Rome performed night like an orchestra that knows its musicians by smell. Scooters muttered. A cat rearranged the dark. Somewhere a bottle met stone and negotiated an armistice. The moon rehearsed its own liturgy behind a cloud that reminded me of a finger on lips. I walked until the river found me and said what rivers say. You can hide anything in a current if you do not care where it ends. I did not throw the key into the water. Keys know how to come back. You will want a moral. You will want a neat hinge that tells you which way the door of this chapter ought to swing. I can offer you only an image, 7 clocks, disagreeing with a devotion that looks like honesty. I can offer a sentence I am learning to trust in the same way you learn to trust a scar after it forgets the pain that made it. Silence wasn't sacred, it was enforced. And I can offer the confession that I am still learning how to speak without believing my voice is a contraband. If you are listening in the dark, do one small thing for me before we go deeper. Count your breaths until you reach the number 7, not 6, not 8, 7. Notice which breath arrives early and which arrives late. That is how clocks sound when they have been taught a catechism. That is how rooms feel when they remember too much. That is how a door begins to open the wrong way, like a story that has decided to become a world. There is a ledger somewhere that still carries my name. On that ledger, a column is reserved for the word corrections. Under it, the arithmetic of what I repaired and what I ruined. The bookkeeper who tends that column will wish to balance it. He will add and subtract and justify and erase. When he is done, he will close the ledger with the piety of an ending. But ledgers are not conclusions. They are only pauses between transactions. This is my first payment against a debt I accepted before I understood interest, and this is the last time I will call the door by the title they preferred, authorized entrance. From here on, it will be what it was, the beginning of a corridor shaped like a question. We will walk it together. I will carry the lamp. You will carry the memory. If, along the way, the clocks begin to sing adjacent notes, and your bones cannot decide which tone to become, do not be afraid. That discomfort is proof you are still a person and not yet an archive. We begin with a door that opens the wrong way. We continue until a door opens that was never there. The first descent is always courteous. It pretends to be nothing more than stair and stone, a polite invitation to cooler air and older dust. They make sure the lamps are softened, that the iron rails have been recently wiped, that your footfalls are quietly returned to you as if the building were listening and did not wish to interrupt. You learn the shape of the steps with your ankles. You count the turns without intending to. Your lungs adjust to a vocabulary of mineral breath. Rome is famous for its ceilings. No guidebook is brave enough to praise its floors. I remember the corridor that led to the archive of corrections by the way it did not echo. Not even voices returned from those walls. Our language went inward, like snow. The paint along the baseboard was the color of old teeth. On the way down, one passes a half-floor landing with an oval window that looks into a courtyard and a fig tree that seems insufficiently Catholic for what it overhears. At night, the tree's leaves shine with the discipline of soldiers. During the day, they look like hands practicing a blessing, failing it, and trying again. You present your folio to a figure in a silver cloak. The graphite worked into the fabric is a practicality. Night work, we were told, requires discretion, but it functions as theology, a glow that chooses its own dimming. The guard glances at the seal, and then at your face, measuring the human margin of error. He never smiles. Smiles are annotations. This place dislikes margins. He says 9 or 11 or sub-level with the indifference of a clock that has learned the hours but dislikes the people who spend them. Room 9 had a window, but it looked onto a wall that had nothing to say. A table, 2 chairs, a cabinet of drawers numbered in Roman numerals that seemed slightly theatrical, as if the furniture wanted you to acknowledge it had a role. On the table, always, an object chosen to tune your conscience like a string, a reliquary with the geometry of a city, a rod of iron that had learned to pretend to be a staff, a box of pins so sharp their shadows looked shaved. On my first week, a book chained to its desk, with a chain that weighed less than the certainty it represented. I lifted a link. It hummed the note of custody. "This one," Sister Ordinary Face said, setting her palm on the chained book with the same careful pressure one uses to calm a skittish horse. "That is not an insult." She was the kind of teacher who could touch a document into forgiveness. "The chain is not punishment," she added. "It is a promise." She watched me the way libraries watch afternoon storms. Open to the leaf with the white scar. The scar was a place where a finger had pressed too hard, long enough ago that the vellum had healed incorrectly and refused to forget it. The script was a round, patient caroling of Latin, the sort of hand that makes a reader feel the scribe's heartbeat. In the margin, a tiny cross and a tinier word. Hook here. Below the scar, a line about a saint who had witnessed a light that behaved like intelligence. The phrase was beautiful, and therefore immediately suspect. "Copy it," she said. "Once true, once corrected." I copied first as truth, then I copied as correction. Behaved like providence. This is the angle at which a miracle becomes an instrument. This is also how you begin to speak in the tone of a weather report that has opinions. They called the floor above us the reading rooms, and the floor beneath us the keep. The keep was not for people like me. Not at first. Its stairs were concrete. Its lights flickered as if they were constantly deciding whether the room deserved to be seen. The smell down there was familiar to anyone who has known hospitals and ship hulls clean and damp at once, as if water had learned to be obedient. When I was finally sent to the keep, it was to observe rather than to touch. "Your hands are not yet disciplined," said the instructor with the ink-dry voice. "Observe how the past is persuaded." Observe we did. A table set with 4 codices and a comb of gold teeth meant for lifting fragments of leaf. A tray of weights like coins that had forgotten nations. A small brazier for warming wax, because some seals must be coached before they agree to remember. In one of the codices, a note in a vicious little hand, a scholar's whisper sharpened into rage. "Tell them I am not a metaphor." The line had been crossed, not scraped. Crossing is kinder. It allows ghosts to keep their handwriting. Across the hall, a room with maps. Maps from coastal monasteries that had been generous with their shorelines, maps from explorers who had not slept enough and drew the night into their oceans by accident. In the dimness, the lapis blues breathed more than the reds. A monk's tragic hand had written Angelus in a place where the wind changes its mind without asking permission. The instruction on our worksheet was to inventory these signs and assign them to allegory. The instruction in my conscience, not yet entirely domesticated, was to ask why the world prefers its angels trapped in margins. If you believe that the holy takes offense when we make a mess of its footnotes, you will not survive the keep. The custodians there spoke about the past like gardeners who know that pruning is less violent than letting a vine drown its own trellis. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps some branches threaten walls. The problem is that the vine is also a memory of light, learning to be green. In pruning, you remove not only weight, but story. You weigh the waste in your palm and it smells like pepper and milk and rain gone gray. The occupations list looked like a joke at first. A chart in a desk drawer, cheaply copied, listing the roles recognized in the keep: corrector, accompanist, binder, sandman, guide. I thought sandman was a scribal pun. It was not. Sandmen sit in the listening booths and read narratives to sleep. They choose a version to tire out another version. They are paid in the currency of a particular satisfaction, the sweetness of a room falling quiet where a quarrel used to live. Binders replaced reliquaries' glass when it sulked. Accompanists hummed a kind of neutral drone that taught hard phrases to soften. Guides did what the name said, but the guiding was inward. A scholar in Prague who had to discover his source was an appendix and not a body. A curator in Santiago who needed to love the second most common pattern in her tapestry. A corrector, officially, is a midwife for facts. Unofficially, a corrector is a locksmith who knows which doors must remain ceremonially locked and which must look like accidents. You learn your teacher's habits the way a dog learns a bell. Sister Ordinary Face liked to place a slip of paper over the phrases she did not want me to want. The white rectangle became a kind of negative magnet. I felt the tug beneath and resented it and, inevitably, lifted it anyway. Under the paper, a woman's name, an evangelist who testified with inconvenient clarity. She will be given a century that speaks more softly, Sister said. She will not mind. Those who mind are, by definition, the wrong century for themselves. NIS, another time, a legend of an angelic visitation documented not by the saint who received it, but by his apprentice, whose hand trembled in admiration and fear. We were told to harmonize. The accounts translate the apprentice's language into the master's cadence, and then to issue permission for only the master's voice to be cited in devotional literature. Not because apprenticeship cannot witness, Sister added, with a look that might have been pity and might have been administrative. Because we prefer single fonts. Sometimes, late, the keep sent us lower still. The stairs turned more intimate, as if the stone knew our names now and wanted to keep them. I remember the first hush room, a chamber engineered to consume sound without mentioning it. Couriers came and went with black folders that were neither urgent nor sluggish, simply inevitable. The chairs were slightly too large, a trick that makes the body feel small and grateful for permission. A man in a silver cloak rubbed ash between his fingers, a habit the Legion had to dull shine and, I suspect, to remember why it was necessary. There in the hush room, I saw my first chained choir. Not a metaphor. 4 men and 3 women behind a screen, each with a thin loop around one wrist attached to a length of slack chain, as if to suggest that their voices belonged to the same page. They sang a vowel you could write down in any language. The vowel had no edges. It behaved like fog. The effect on the room was precise. Timetables softened, memories unbuttoned their collars, certainties unlearned their posture. A curator from elsewhere laid a small relic on the table. Bone, probably, but possibly wood that had loved a saint long enough to learn an imitation and asked for the vowel in his accent. The choir obliged. The bone became polite. I ought to tell you about the first time a book resisted. Resistance is the story beneath every story told in the keep. We call it variance, or stubborn heroism, or when filling out the form, recurrence. It happened with a psalter whose margins were crowded with drawings of little hares, not because the scribe loved hares, though he might have, but because his hand could not stop itself from making joy while copying duty. The hares were harmless, we thought, until one of them began to point. Its tiny ink paw indicated a line that had been reconciled a generation ago to avoid a theological stumble. The hare pointed, and the page buckled a little, and in the buckling the reconciliation looked suddenly like paint on dry skin. We do not exorcise books. We negotiate with them. The negotiation required a sandman, a syrup of vowels, and the admission that the line might be allowed to cough in certain editions. Everything down there smelled a little like a room where a lamp had just been blown out. A sweetness and a scolding. The sweetness said, "Sleep now, we've done the work for you." The scolding said, "Do not ask us how." I kept my notebook and wrote not the facts, those belong to the desks upstairs, but gestures. The way Sister's hand hovered before she placed the paper slip, the angle of the guard's head when he pretended not to be reading your face, the way the choir's chains rattled exactly once when the archivist mispronounced a vowel. Gesture is the honest part of a lie. I was still learning then which of my senses to trust. Sight is a collaborator. Give it a uniform and it stands straighter. Touch, in the keep, is deceived by reverence. No one wants to bruise a page that looks back. Smell mutinies constantly. Sound is the informant on whom you may rely, provided you accept it will bring you news you cannot use in court. The best witness I had was weight. A thing weighed what it wanted to weigh. Documents that had surrendered to our corrections grew lighter, as if relieved. Documents that merely pretended to surrender grew heavier, as if packing a suitcase for escape. One afternoon, a crate arrived with a seal I wasn't cleared to read. This is a silly sentence. Of course I read it. The wax, the color of old cherries, had an imprint of a key within a key, a cleverness I resented. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had at some point been part of a veil, a small clock, its face carved with not numbers but moons. The instruction with it was maddeningly cheerful, synchronized to market noon. The city outside the walls kept market time noon by the appetite of commerce, while our building kept devotional time noon by the posture of a prayer. The difference was usually a minute or two, sometimes 5, occasionally 13. The clock with moons refused both. It ticked by a sky of its own. We set it on a shelf between 2 chained books and listened. When market noon struck, the clock sighed. When devotional noon arrived, it clicked its tongue like a grandmother who wants you to do better. At a moment that belonged only to the moons, a swallow winged through the open window, executed a frantic, perfect circle, and departed as if embarrassed by grace. Sister Ordinary Face watched me watch the bird. "Consider absence," she said, as if making a note. "It is an index, too." The shifts grew longer. Food lost its hour, and became an interruption. Even prayer, which is permitted everywhere and always, was encouraged to be brief and in the verb mood of the office, let occur, let align, let pacify. I kept thinking of the fig tree on the landing and its honest daylight. In the keep, leaf and light and page and promise all had to learn the grammar of compliance. My own name began to echo in my bones, as if someone down the hall had said it, had then denied saying it, had then asked me, with kindness, to sign for the denial. A list of the things I thought I could live with, changing the tense of a miracle so it could be taught without argument, moving a feast day to spare a village, a riot, renaming a woman's authorship as witness so that a synod would nod and go home and sleep. A shorter list of the things I could not, removing a poem which proved a man's tenderness because his cruelty made for better policy, relocating a martyr's death to a season when blood is less bright, persuading a map to accept an ocean that did not want to be invented yet. The longer list keeps winning in rooms with locks. The shorter list keeps me awake. You will ask why I stayed. That is the honest question. The reasons at the time felt noble. To guide the corrections toward mercy. To prevent worse butchers from doing the pruning. To be inside the engine with a rag to catch the oil. The real reason is simpler and uglier. I was good at it, and the keep rewards competence the way fire rewards oxygen. The better you get, the calmer the rooms grow around you. Calm is addictive. Calm is the sugar they stir into the iron taste of the work. One evening, later than seemed sensible, a courier from the Legion of Silver Cloaks asked for me by name that was not my name. You prefer rooms with maps, he said, which was true. He brought me to a vault where the air had been taught to stay still. On the table, a vellum globe, its seas polished with centuries of fingertips, its continents at once familiar and stubbornly wrong. Here, a peninsula extended like a thought someone had not yet finished. There, an island sulked where no island should. Tiny letters in a monk's furious hand annotated the stubbornness. Here the angels descend in lamplight. Here the sea forgets its name. He gave me a quill and a very simple instruction. Decide which is metaphor. I did not decide that night. Instead, I found, when I tilted the globe gently, that a seam ran along a latitude like a healed wound. A seam you do not notice unless your hands have been educated by mistakes. The seam was not in the skin of the world, but in the story of it. I looked up at the courier. He looked at the door. The room arranged its silence to make the decision sound inevitable. I asked, though I knew better, whether we had a policy for lamplight angels and amnesiac seas. Yes, he said, with the kindness of a knife. We do not like them. He smiled, in a way that meant, copy the map until it believes it never said such a thing. When I returned to room 9, the lapis star map waited with the patience of a teacher who has seen too many students and cannot afford to love another. In the top right margin, the tiny Latin note about the angel's sign had been crossed again and again, soft, like a lullaby with erasures. If you pressed your ear to the blue, a hum answered something between a bee's approval and a wire's complaint. I made a mark in my notebook, not of what the map said, but of how it behaved. Behavior is testimony, where speech has been bribed. In the weeks that followed, the keep trusted me with more contradictory things. A wooden box that gained weight when prayers were said too quickly near it. A tapestry whose blue threads bled into fingers only when a certain psalm was sung. A ledger from a monastery that had never existed, meticulously recording wheat, salt, and the prices of silence. The ledger was full of names I could not find elsewhere. Men and women with dates that refused to cooperate. The column labeled corrections had a neat hand and an impatience you could hear even with your eyes. I felt the ledger tilt toward me like a question, and understood that my answer would be graded by a building. Do not believe that the keep is humorless. It cultivates a strain of wit that can only grow indoors, fierce about commas, irreverent about miracles that misbehave, oddly sentimental about ink recipes, and the feel of clean paper under the wrist. Sister Ordinary Face once told a joke so precise it made a guard cough into his sleeve to disguise a laugh. "What is the difference between heresy and footnote?" she asked. A room of faces bent over pens. Audience. A dangerous joke to love. I loved it anyway. Then came the assignment that moved me from observer to accomplice. A gospel, not canonical, but beloved by stubborn scholars who enjoy a woman too much when she speaks clearly. Our task was not destruction. Destruction shouts and leaves smoke. Our task was context, to produce an edition so handsomely introduced, so gravely footnoted, so immaculate with historical sensitivity, that no reader would reach the body of the text without the sense of having been accompanied into proper doubt. We were to be affectionate with our undermining. The preface alone would lull an army. I sharpened a pencil until it resembled a threat. I wrote sentences that braided compliments into cautions. I practiced the smile of a letter that wishes to be loved but intends to be obeyed. I read the woman's voice aloud in the keep's quiet, and something in the air leaned forward and asked why my mouth tasted like coins. On the way home, the fig tree on the landing raised all its hands and did not bless me. It was during that edition that the first rumor about the Shadow Crusade reached my floor in a form someone pretended to be careless with. A sheet, left under my blotter, describing a mission that sounded like a fairy tale told by an accountant. A chapel whose murals refused to stay corrected. Saints reappeared after whitewash. Halos returned like stubborn moons. The Legion arrived with a rubric and a hymn in a key most instruments do not like. At the third verse, the paint sighed and lay down as if tired. No paint should have a sigh. The report concluded, in the patient voice of a veteran. Recurrence ceased after application of tone theta. Catalog is pacified. I read the line twice and wondered who the alphabet thought it was. From then on, every descent felt less courteous. The steps seemed to change the relationship of my knees with my optimism. The lamps clicked more often, like insects with opinions. The silver cloaks accumulated a sheen of human hour that no graphite could dull. Papers became heavier. Names became light. Truth began to behave like a wild animal I had been letting sleep at my feet. It did not belong to me. It had teeth. You will say, perhaps, that I speak poetically, because I am afraid to speak plainly. You are right, but I will give you one plain thing. In a cupboard in the keep, there is a box labeled Minor Repairs. In that box is a tool that looks like a butter knife married to a word. It is used for lifting seals without breaking them. Its handle remembers the fingers of the dead. The tool is nicknamed Mercy. The person who told me this did not smile. I have not yet told you about the man who taught me to hear ink. He is relevant now. He said that iron gall ink oxidizes as it ages. It darkens, then lightens, then cracks. Lies, he maintained, glitter forever. He tapped a letter and made it ring with his nail, as if testing a glass for flaws. If you learn to listen, he said, You will be able to hear when a word has agreed to be corrected and when it has merely learned our pronunciation. He invited me to put my ear to the page. I did. That was the day I began to dream in indexes. You will also want a picture, so I will give you one that belongs entirely to the keep and to no theology at all. A hallway with a floor so well waxed, the lamps above it move when you move. The reflection is not a mirror of the lights, but of your walking. This is the keep's kindest joke. It teaches you to watch your own footsteps, as if they were instructions written by a building that knows where you are headed. By the time the Legion came for me with a mission of my own, I had learned to slow my breathing the way one slows it in the presence of a dog that could befriend or bite. Night had the blue of lapis and the unkind humor of doors that open quieter than sin. A correction has failed in an outer room, the courier said, which is a sentence like a fire alarm in a library. He led me to a chapel that did not wish to behave, where saints insisted on returning. He had a hymn folded like a blade. I recognized the key. It was the color of sleep. But that is ahead of our chapter. Here, in the catalogue of rooms beneath Rome, we remain with names of drawers and the discipline of chairs, with the chain that is a promise, and the book that consented to be anchored because it loved what it told. We remain with the star map humming beneath my thumb, with the moon clock that refused the market's noon and the church's noon and insisted on the skies. We remain with the ledger that made a small sound, almost a cough, when the column labeled corrections was cleared too quickly. Keep with me this one instruction, the one I learned before I learned to doubt it. A story is a hallway. Our work is to decide which doors it is allowed to pass. You may take that as a threat. I offer it to you now as a key. The hallway will exist whether or not you approve of what walks it. If you must chain a door, name the chain. If you must move a feast, tell the moon what you are doing and accept its silence as neither assent nor refusal but weather. I am not yet out of the keep. I am not yet a voice speaking from the safety of distance. I am still on the stair, the polite one, counting turns I did not intend to count, noticing how the steps keep the rhythm of someone else's breath. Above me, Rome produces night like consolation. Below me, a choir practices vowels that can be mistaken for mercy. Between, there is a room that smells like the moment a candle is asked to stop being sun. In that room, on a table, is a quill that has learned my hand better than I have. And on a shelf nearby, a clock with moons which waits, with an expression I refuse to anthropomorphize, for an hour only it believes in. I will go to that room now. I will touch the chain, and it will hum the note of custody. I will open the book to the white scar where the finger pressed too much living into the page, and the page consented to remember. I will copy once true, once corrected. I will feel the air lean closer to listen for which version I love, and in loving, I will betray both. That is the spell here. Love is the best solvent. It lifts ink without tearing the leaf. It leaves behind, in the right light, a ghost of what you thought you could survive. Later, when I stand in a chapel that refuses to forget and a silver cloak hands me a hymn that tastes like sleep, I will recall this chapter of stairs and desks and chains and moons, and I will understand what the keep has been schooling me toward. Not obedience, not even discretion, but a still more perilous tenderness for the wrong things. That is the true chain. That is the promise. For now, The fig tree rustles its night-lit leaves in a courtyard no one will mention in an archive that mentions everything. For now, a guard's graphite cloak is a comet that refuses to be a lesson. For now, the keep is courteous. For now, the rooms beneath Rome behave as if they had nothing to hide and everything to correct. For now, I am still the kind of priest whose name does not appear in photographs. For now, the door opens inward, and I politely go through. I was given a folder the color of dry bone and told to read it slowly, as if speed might wake something better left sleeping. The title, handwritten in a confident, unbeautiful script, read, De Vacuo Saeculo, on the empty century. I had learned by then that Latin was not a language in the archive, so much as a temperature. It warmed lies into pliancy. It cooled truths into marble. The folder smelled faintly of lamp oil and a fruit I could not name from a country I had not visited. The paper inside had the brittle dignity of pages that learned to exist with very little air. The premise announced itself in the careful tones of a surgeon meeting a family. There are intervals in the world's chronology which, when reconciled, yield a cleaner, more stable history. It began. The operation is simple. The scar, if we are diligent, will not be noticed except by those already inclined to bleed. I do not exaggerate. It referred to the world as a patient, the calendar as a bone to be set, the stubbornness of dates as inflammation. Then, in neat, numbered sections, it proposed what I had not yet believed possible: to add time that never was, to graft 3 phantom generations into the chronology and stitch them with regnal lists, feast day reforms, and the readjudication of eclipses. I closed the folder as one closes a mouth on a scream. The room did not change temperature. The lamps continued their small dignities. Somewhere, above me, a clock refused to choose between 2 minutes. I opened the folder again and read the section on the body mechanics of calendars. 13 days slid from the Julian to the Gregorian like coins from a priest's sleeve. Feast days moved by pious arithmetic. A list of saints lost their birthdays and were reassigned more docile seasons. Kings received reigns that made sense to archivists. Popes learned to be consecutive in the way a staircase is consecutive, even when the building is not. Why do it? The folder answered with a sincerity I have come to regard as an instrument. Because chronology is the skeleton of belief. Break a bone and the body still walks. It simply learns a different gait. If the gait is harmonious, the body suffers less. Harmony is mercy. There was a graph ink ruled, faultlessly modest, showing a decline in narrative dissonance after each adjustment. The graph looked like consolation. The graph looked like a lullaby. I turned to a thin annex, labeled Index Librorum Catenatorum, the index of chained books. I had always thought of chains as punitive, but the archive had taught me to see them as a promise. The annex listed volumes kept under literal iron theology, yes, but also atlases, a cookbook that refused to alter its seasons, a ledger from a monastery that neither existed nor ever stopped insisting it did. Someone had annotated the index with small, angry dots that might have been sweat fallen from a forehead. Stabilizers. The heading read. I recognized the tone from music. Notes meant not to be heard, but to prevent collapse. The chained books occupied their own climate, a weather of brass and old heat. Touch a chain, and you could feel the hum of a room deciding where the world should be allowed to stay. We were told never to remove a chain lightly. A chain is an oath, Sister Ordinary Face had said once, laying her fingers on an iron link the way one might touch a sleeping child's wrist to check for fever. It is not a threat. It is the grammar of keeping, yet, each time a chain was lifted, a breeze entered the room not from a window, but from the feeling of a page about to prove it still had lungs. If calendars were bone and chains were grammar, maps were tricksters. The cartography vault breathed under its door like an animal at rest. Inside, centuries of geography argued politely in pigment, coastlines that learned humility, rivers that practiced reinventing their mouths. I learned a cartographer's anthropology, that every map tells you not just where a people thought they lived, but how they wished to understand their obedience. A vellum globe, its seas polished by centuries of fingertips, refused to be corrected. The monk who drew it had written, in a script furious with restraint, Hic Angelus descendit in Lucerne, lumine here the angel descends in lamplight, where, in an inlet, that current Atlas's name with a word for fog, a word that makes ships slow and saints keep their distance. Beside that, another note, Hic mare oblivicitur, nomini sui. Here the sea forgets its name. We were instructed to assign these to allegory. I wrote the proper entry on the proper form. Then I did the improper thing and pressed my ear to the globe's skin. It hummed very softly, the way a wineglass hums if you teach it to be an instrument. Later, when I tilted the globe just right, a seam revealed itself along a latitude like a healed wound. That is how I learned that stories also scar, and the scar can be the truest part. The manuals described other instruments, the Eclipse Clock beneath the dome, for instance. Not the clock on the facade, not the clock for tourists and pigeons, but the hidden one with a face of blackened silver and a hand that moved only when certain events happened elsewhere. Think of it as a weather station, a corrector told me, for disturbances in continuity. Synchronize it, the manual said, to mark it noon and devotional noon, and then ignore both, because the clock answered to a third noon, the hour at which a decision made in a council room 4,000 miles away slicked the timeline like oil. The clock found relation without contact. It chimed without sound, a small change in room pressure, a swallow in the throat of air. And the project of mirrors, at first I thought it gossip. Mirrors trained, with layers of lacquer and prayers learned in wrong orders, to show different scenes depending on who stood before them. A devotee of a certain saint would see a minor miracle obediently confirm his saint's narrative. A scholar trained in a rival tradition would see a parable that minimized the same saint's agency. The paint did not alter. The light did. A museum that curdled into catechism when the faithful looked on it. I put my hand to a mirror's edge and felt heat, the way a wall feels hot on the other side of a stove. The instruction accompanying the mirror used a terrible phrase, audience-aware veracity. It was around then that I met the binders of memory. They entered without introduction. Men and women whose robes had the careful plainness of a uniform that does not wish to be remembered. Their vocation was removal by praise. Do not be shocked. You have seen it before in other rooms of your life. A saint's legend grows muscular, dangerous. A binder does not argue. A binder commissions 3 hagiographies that speak in 3 eras' voices and ensures that the one most flattering in the least relevant century is the one that becomes universally quoted. The saint eases into a century he does not belong to like a traveler guided to the wrong platform by a polite official. When history returns to check the ticket, the man is gone and the train has a different destination. The ledger marks an absence, as if it were a kindness. The feast day falls across an old rebellion like snow. I asked a binder once whether he slept. He answered with the candor of craftsmen, "Better when I have taken a name gently," he said. "Worse when I have snapped it." He showed me a list of spoken names fading from a diocese's memory. A Nicholas who taught filthy nobles to wash. A Lucia who organized kitchens with more ferocity than any general. A Sylvanus who taught children to read scripture as if it were written in their own hand. "None of them have been killed," the binder said. "They have been repurposed." He said the last word with the fatigue of a man holding a brick that had once been an altar. Sandmen. I have mentioned the chained choir across the screen. Wrists looped with loose assurance, singing vowels that the ear mistakes for architecture. They do not erase. They fatigue. They code events with sleep the way pains collect the breath of winter. When they stop, the room is quieter, not because truth was removed, but because insistence was coached into the tone of a lullaby. Once, during a test, they were asked to sing at a painting of a massacre so that a child could be brought through the gallery without crying. Their vowel did not absolve. It muffled. The curator wrote on the form, "Acceptable for school groups." I watched the brushstrokes calm like horses in rain. All these instruments, the chains, the calendars, the clocks, the mirrors, the choirs teach you a doctrine that no catechism admits. The world can be made to cohere if you are willing to be cruel to its memories. The cruelty is not flamboyant. It is administrative. Its gloves smell of beeswax and mineral water. It smiles with permission. I became skilled at it. I corrected a ledger so that revolutionaries became donors. I tuned a psalm to make a queen's conscience more plausible. I issued a permission that fused 2 feasts because a bishop calculated that 2 processions would bankrupt the city. Each time I did, a small, precise part of me applauded. Harmony is seductive. It is the sugar they stir into the iron taste. Then came the eclipse week. It is not named that in the files. I name it thus because everything turned in a light that felt occluded. The moon clock refused every noon. The mirrors fogged on their own, as if the room were ashamed. The chained books grew heavier. The choir's chains clinked not once but twice. And the index of chained books, dear God, contained a fresh entry written in a hand I recognized as my own. I do not remember writing it. Codex 17K, chained on order of. There was a gap where my name would be, then a line. Rationale. Recurrence beyond tolerable threshold. Correction failing to adhere. My thumbprint in the wax rose like a fossil in a road. The codex in question was a psalter, a book of hymns and prayers that had learned, like certain rivers, to flood in the same places no matter how one rerouted its tributaries. It was illustrated by a person who loved creation more than doctrine. Hares, yes, but also moons that behaved like intelligence and stars that had the sedate faces of auditors. The line the hares pointed to refused reconciliation. It read, in its young hand, "The light answered like a person." The corrected line read, "The light answered like providence." The hares returned each time with their little paws, moved the finger to person, and dared the page to admit it had ever said otherwise. We had chained it, not to imprison it, but to prevent the room from drifting to wherever the psalter believed truth lived. The hares taught me to distrust anesthetics. I began to listen for the sound a lie makes when it agrees to our pronunciation, but keeps its own name. You may think this melodrama, but words, under pressure, behave like bones. Set roughly, they leave a limp. Set gently to the wrong length, they make a gait that looks beautiful and hurts only in weather. Sister Ordinary Face found me bent over the psalter and stood so quietly the room's pressure changed before the air acknowledged her body. She did not scold. She slid into the chair like a page settling after a breath. When you correct a line, she said, correct a dozen things you cannot see. That is why we prefer to correct the correctors, not the line. Her fingers were stained with the walnut ink used for marginalia. Every stain on her skin looked like intelligence that had failed to be spoken. She placed a slip of paper on the margin, the same trick, the same negative magnet. I did not lift it. She smiled, not unkindly. You are learning. Aid way. Is phaser vis? I asked her then something I rarely risked, how much phantom time a world could endure. She considered the question with the seriousness one gives to a child who has just used the word death correctly for the first time. Less than we have added, she said. More than you fear. She tapped the folder on empty centuries with a nail like a comma. The patient has healed around the stitches. The scar is stable. The pain fluctuates with weather. She glanced toward the ceiling. We have many ceilings. A few days later, the Legion of Silver Cloaks conducted a rehearsal in the hush room. I did not have access. Rehearsals are for those who carry instruments other than pencils. But a sandman I had befriended let me stand near the door and listen to the logic. The Legion had a corrective hymn in a key I would come to recognize, the key that tastes like sleep. The hymn has no lyrics. It is all vowel and architecture. The Legion's captain, voice like a slammed atlas, described the intervention. A chapel that refused the edit, paintings blooming their saints back out of whitewash, halos rising stubbornly like bread. The plan was to sing tone theta at the third measure, when paint is most vulnerable to suggestion. Someone asked about recurrence. Catalog is pacified, the captain said. I heard our alphabet agree to be a cudgel. I began to mark my notebook with a new column. Behaviors of time. In it went things I could not justify and did not wish to forget. The swallow that circled the map room when the moon clock struck its private noon. The way the 7 clocks in the Theater of Confessions disagreed with such devotion, it looked almost like honesty. A guard whose graphite cloak shed a comet tail only when I told myself the truth instead of writing it. A saint's name that returned in the mouths of children even after the bindery had served 4 exemplary biographies, and a preface that kissed the name out of the century in which it belonged. Each behavior made the room more precise, not less. Precision, I learned, is the conscience's way of begging you to stop. I must tell you about the questioner. He is not an official role. He is a defect in my memory that developed shape. He was an old man with a face like a folded map, the kind that cracks if you open it without pity. He appeared where rules were obeyed too tightly, in a library where a dedicated corrector had tuned a set of chronicles until a king's cruelty became stern mercy. The questioner stood between shelves and said, very softly, "For whom?" In a gallery where the project of mirrors had been installed so thoroughly that believers saw only what would keep them docile. The questioner asked, quietly, "To whom does this gift belong?" He asked much, and required little. I do not know if he was an invention of conscience or a man hired by the archive to prevent professionals from turning into ideologues. It does not matter. His question remains, for whom does a harmony play? The eclipse week culminated in a meeting I was not meant to attend. The man from the theater, the one whose posture could have been a sword, stood at the head of a table polished to a fragile mirror. Around him, binders, sandmen, correctors, and 2 legions marked by the graphite on their cuffs. He spoke plainly, which is a kind of respect. "We are not protecting truth," he said in the tone of minutes. "We are protecting memory. Truth is turbulent. Memory is useful. Nations are made of it. I have repeated his words to you before. Repetition is how people like me absolve ourselves for the first time we were too stunned to reply." A binder asked whether the project of mirrors would be expanded. "Only where patrons approve," the man said smoothly. "Consent is currency." A sandman asked what to do about the psalter with the hares that pointed to person. "Compromise," he answered. "Permit recurrence in scholarly editions. Exhaust it there. Sleep it elsewhere." He used sleep as a verb and did not lower his eyes. When the meeting adjourned, the moon clock sighed a little. "You will think me fanciful. I accept the critique." But the air lifted and set like a bird uncertain of its own wings. That night, I walked the stair with the courtesy worn out of it. The fig tree on the landing had left a single leaf on the windowsill, and the leaf had dried into the shape of a listening ear. I took it into my palm and felt how a form persists even after its water is gone. Bones, maps, chains, clocks, mirrors, choirs, all instruments of coherence. And yet, in my hand, a fossil of listening that no instrument could teach. I put the leaf back in room 9. I opened De Vacuo Saeculo and wrote a sentence in the margin that I did not intend to write and could not bear to erase. An empty century is also a full silence, a clumsy sentence, but true. Into a silence, anything can be placed. Saints unmade by praise, popes rearranged by mercy, calendars that walk differently and call it health. I pressed my thumb to the page. The oil left a small, traitorous oval. You will ask what, precisely, broke me. It was not the empty century. It was not the chained book. It was not even the hymn that put paint to bed. It was a child's homework, filed accidentally with our papers, a worksheet from a school museum visit where the project of mirrors had served a perfectly digestible version of a violent age. In clumsy pencil, the child had written, "History is when the grown-ups pick one story so the kids won't get scared." The teacher had written in the margin, "Good summary," a smiley face. The graphite mouth curved like a chain. I waited in the theater of confessions until the 7 clocks agreed for their single minute. Then I set them all to midnight. One by one they refused. It was comforting. An animal is easier to love than a machine. I left the room and found the corridor where the legion kept their ash, the dish of graphite they rubbed into their cloaks to dull them for night. I rubbed my fingers in the ash and made a mark on the inner lining of my jacket. I do not know why, perhaps because I wished to carry some warning inside my clothes. Perhaps because I wanted the door that would not open for me to recognize my hands when I put them on its face. In the days that followed, I performed my tasks with a care that looked like obedience and was, in fact, farewell. I corrected a date and then corrected my correction by leaving it wrong. I approved a preface and then wrote, anonymously, a reader's report that called the preface beautiful and dangerous and suggested we publish it only where footnotes go to die. I replaced a saint's accusing century with a century that offered him tea. I looked at the moon clock and told it, without language, that I knew who it was. You might be waiting for the explosion, for the corridor of alarm, for the sprinting guards and the slammed gates. That is not how edits to time end. They end with paperwork. They end with the correct form, the approved vocabulary, the right graph, the signatures aligned tidily in their lines. They end with a stamp whose ink has the warmth of a person's skin. They end with a coat put on a chair. They end with a key that decides to be heavy. It was in the last hour of the last day of the eclipse week that I understood how the archive had domesticated something older than faith. Not truth, not even memory, but the human dizziness before too much sky. We had built ceilings, carefully, consecutively, lovingly. But even the best ceiling does not teach the sky manners. It only teaches you to look down. This chapter is called The Edits to Time, because that is the work's boast. I tell it to you as confession, because that is what the work becomes in the mouth of anyone who has learned to hear ink, to weigh maps, to love the wrong things. I cannot give you the moon clock. I cannot give you the psalter with the pointing hares. I can give you this. If a calendar shifts near you, if days step aside, like courteous men or seasons swap cloaks at the door, ask whose hands moved them. If a saint appears where you did not expect him, ask which century lost him and who profited. If a mirror shows you a scene that comforts and convinces, move. Make the mirror work for it. Refuse to be the audience that supplies the veracity. When I left, the clocks disagreed. The hares pointed to person. The map hummed like a bee. The chain hummed like a promise. The folder lay open to the page where I had written my foolish margin. The graphite on my fingers looked like the shadow of a dove that had changed its mind. I closed the door, and it opened the wrong way. Recruitment was not a ceremony. It was a correction to my schedule. A courier whose name never practiced being a name found me in room 9, stood so still the air did not know where to flow around him, and said, "You have been observed to prefer maps." Preference was the Legion's favorite alibi for destiny. He did not ask whether I agreed. He placed an envelope on the table, the paper thick with that soft, furry nobility that expensive donors mistake for holiness, and said, "Tonight, it's over." The address, when I turned it over in my hand, had the posture of a confession, levels below the keep, a door whose hinge had been trained to imitate a sigh. I had always imagined that the Legion kept a barracks with flags and footlockers and some ancient insult carved into a beam. The room I entered was more intimate than that. A long table, waxed to a thin, greasy brilliance. A row of cloaks hanging like disciplined weather. A case of instruments so carefully arranged that it made me ashamed of my desk. There is a smell that belongs to the Legion. Not incense, not steel, beeswax and graphite, and a sweetness like the moment a pear gives up. A captain whose face looked borrowed from a Roman coin gestured to a chair. "We dull the cloaks with ash," he said, noticing my gaze, "so night will not take offense." He unrolled a piece of cloth with a tenderness that might have been piety, and revealed a set of keys whose teeth made a language I could almost read. "Librarians with swords," I said, attempting a joke to verify whether humor was legal. His mouth made a decision not to smile. "Archivists with permissions," he corrected. We prefer verbs. They began with oaths, not the ones that bind the soul's wrists, but the kind that teach the tongue a slower grammar. I will choose the smallest violence that attains coherence. I will not remove what may be redirected. I will lay no hand on a name that is already fading of its own will. The oaths tasted like warm metal. As the captain spoke, a sandman entered no chain on the wrist tonight. The slack loop coiled like a sleeping snake in his palm, and hummed the vowel that teaches rooms to stop interrupting. Silence settled without offense. Even the lamps agreed. Training was a tour of instruments disguised as errands. We walked the corridor where the graphite dishes waited, the ash rubbed into silver so that silver would remember humility. "Shine only when no one looks," the captain said, and the command was aimed not at the cloak but at me. We paused at a case where a sword lay asleep on velvet. I recognized it, though I had never seen it. "It has never drawn blood," he said, hearing my bones say weapon. "It belongs to a different kind of war." He did not elaborate. In the Legion, you learn to be grateful for the sentences that end before the lie begins. They fitted me for a cloak, measured not with a tailor's tape, but with a librarian's eye. The fall should resemble a drawn curtain, the hood a parenthesis, the hem a decision. A seamstress whose needles had the social skills of vipers marked my shoulders with chalk. "Hold still," she said, though I was holding still. "Your stillness moves." The Legion's catechism is procedural. It is a grammar for coercing realities into cooperation. First tense, entry. A correction fails in an outer room. The report uses phrases that try not to look bruised. Recurrence noted, imagery persistent, devotions non-compliant. A courier fetches us with a tone that makes even the floorboards sober. We inventory light how it falls, what it favors. We test the walls for memory. We set a moon clock on a chair and wait to see which noon it chooses. We explain, softly, to the parish or museum or orphanage that we are here to help with coherence. The word behaves, second tense, accompaniment. Before we touch documents, we touch breath. A sandman hums the vowel, and the room relaxes its jaw. An accompanist sets a drone at the base of hearing. The Legion has learned what any good choir knows. Truth can be shouted, but it cannot be tuned without the scaffolding of tone. If a painting refuses to be quieted, we do not argue with it. We change the air. Paint is a lung. Teach it a different oxygen, and it sighs. "Tone theta at the third measure," the captain will murmur, and you feel the mural's pigment make the decision to be tired. Third tense. Substitution. The scholar in Prague who refuses to let go of a gospel we prefer to be apocryphal is not to be punished. He is to be loved by a facsimile. We put in his hands a book indistinguishable by any sense that can be defended in public. Same foxed edges, same spine taught to creak, same marginalia. In a hand so perfectly forgery that I felt the original grow doubtful of itself across a border. Only one line is different, the one that turns a woman's witness into a rumor. He will nod, relieved to possess the thing he loves, and he will footnote, obediently, the rumor. Fourth tense, praise. Removal by praise is a sacrament here. Do not argue a saint out of a century. Praise him into a century whose compliments cannot hurt anyone. We commission the hagiographies, we choose the fonts, we rehearsal the interviews, we gift an art historian, an archive room at midnight, and then quote her morning afterwards until she forgets which sentence was hers. We soften the thunder in the story's chest to a kind of holy weather. Fifth tense. Sleep. This is the tone theta the captain swears by with his quiet, ruthless love. We do not erase, we exhaust. The chained choir sings the vowel until insistence is embarrassed by its own stamina and learns manners. In the Legion, sleep is not a permission, it is an instrument. They gave me 3 missions as a novice. The first was the chapel I have already confessed to you, the one that kept resurrecting its halos like bread that refuses to be flat. We arrived after Compline, when rooms are best at pretending to be harmless. The captain counted the steps from door to altar and wrote the number on his palm. Numbers are the only prayers the Legion admits out loud. A fresco of ordinary saints fishermen with earnest hands, a widow with a gaze that had paid for things with itself, insisted on reappearing after the parish painter's repeated whitewashes. We laid a cloth on the floor, as if preparing for a picnic with ghosts. The choir behind the screen inhaled as one creature. "Tilt the lamps," the captain murmured. "Teach the shadows new habits." We tilted. The saints softened at the edges, like kindness that has agreed to be practical. The choir introduced tone theta, not as command but suggestion. At the third measure, the paint made a sound like wet parchment settling onto the truth of its surface. I felt the note move through my teeth. The parish priest watched with the wrecked gratitude of a man whose house has stopped leaking. We left behind a pamphlet, printed on dignified paper, titled, "On the Mercy of Harmonies in Sacred Art." It said nothing and explained everything. The second mission was colder, which is to say more administrative. A reliquary had been exhibiting the wrong weight if handled by a certain family. Weight, as I have told you, is testimony. You can teach a face to lie, but weight betrays itself by gravity. We arrived with a scale polished into a theology and a form that asked all the pertinent, innocent questions. How long has it weighed this way? Whose hands? Which hours? The reliquary, a sliver of bone or wood, pretending successfully to be bone, was placed onto felt with the reverence of a tiny coronation. The family approached. The numbers shifted as if counting sins. We sang not the sleep vowel but a different architecture, thinner and brighter, a tone that tells rooms to admit what they already know. The weight swayed, considered mercy, and consented to mean the same for everyone. The family, poor and lovely in their fear, cried as if forgiven. I filled out the form, felt my hand grow light, felt my soul become stationary. The third mission took me to Prague. A scholar I have warned you about by parable greeted us with tea that tasted like the honorable exhaustion of oak. His hands were those of a man whose library has learned to be family. On his desk, the gospel beloved by the wrong century. He did not posture. He spoke its name with the small awe you hear at births and at bedside miracles, where the miracle is that anyone is still choosing to stay. We did not steal his book. We placed a twin upon his desk, whose text made one substitution at the fulcrum of a woman's authority. We did not threaten him. We offered a grant, a symposium, a trip to a room in the Vatican where he could touch the chained volumes he had dreamed about since he was 20 and too poor to visit. He cried again. This time the tears of a man being afforded dignity by his jailers. The legionnaire beside me held the door with such professional courtesy I wanted to hurt him. Courtesy is the most effective glove. When we returned to Rome, the captain led us not back to the barracks, that isn't but to a room that had the cautious luxury of a diplomat's office. Simple, polished, merciless. On the table, the sword that never draws blood, asleep in its velvet cradle. He opened the glass quietly, the way you open the memory of someone you do not want to startle, and lifted the scabbard to his face. "Smell," he said, "frankincense, wood polish, and the dusk of childhood churches. Objects remember us longer than we remember them," he said. "Our task is to teach them which of us to prioritize." He placed the scabbard back as if I had been an altar and said, almost gently, "You will be told we correct for truth. We do not. We correct for memory." He did not credit the line to the man from the theater. Perhaps the Legion owns its sentences communally. He showed me a small tin of ash and dipped 2 fingers into it. "Graphite to dull shine," he said, and streaked his cloak with what looked like contrition. "Shine only when no one looks," he repeated, and a choir on the far side of the wall breathed a chord in agreement. What of recruitment, you will ask? Where was the choice? The Legion does not seduce. It recognizes. It taps you where your craft has already bent itself to usefulness. It says, "We require your preference," and makes it sound like a courtesy. The oath book bears no signatures. It bears fingerprints in graphite, iterations of the same human smear taught to serve as evidence in a court that never convenes. I stayed because the rooms around the Legion are engineered to reward competence with silence. Silence is a wage you cannot spend until you leave. I stayed because the work used the parts of me that could pace themselves into ethics, precision, restraint, the affection for a sentence that does not spill. I stayed because the captain knew how to account for my lies before I learned how to weigh them. And I stayed because the cloak, when it settled on my shoulders, felt like permission to be the most disciplined version of my cowardice. The questioner found me anyway, in the museum that had been lacquered with the project of mirrors until the faithful received comfort and the skeptical received consistency. He stood before a painting and whispered, "For whom is the mercy?" I did not answer. The painting, which had surrendered across centuries to repainting and neglect and the chummed waters of fashion, looked back at us with the particular contempt of a thing that knows it is being used to soothe. The hush in the room was an accomplice. The Sandman, behind his screen, tuned his vowel to a whisper. The painting sighed. I wanted to break the mirror and teach the room to love a mess. I adjusted a lamp instead. There is a ledger. There is always a ledger in which the Legion records its small violences and their measured mercies. The column headings would not offend anyone in daylight. Recurrence, tonality, resistance, pacification. The notation for a success is a circle that looks like a saint's halo demoted to paperwork. The notation for a failure is a tiny cross, not because anyone died, but because the room learned to die less obediently. I added my circles with a hand that learned neatness from guilt. One night, the captain took me to the hush room after the lamps were supposed to have forgotten we existed. The choir unchained their wrists as if releasing a thought. He placed in front of me a file with my name in a handwriting too confident to be mine. Inside, my report from Prague, my diagram of the chapel's lamps, my line about the reliquary's weight confessing its bias. He tapped the diagram. "You count well," he said. He tapped the line about the bias. "You confess better." He tapped the Prague page, the single substitution that taught a woman how to be less than witness. He did not tap that one. "Be very careful," he said. "Tenderness is the most dangerous skill here. Tenderness for the wrong things, do you remember? That is the Keep's true curriculum. The Legion merely graduates you. On my last mission before the unraveling began in earnest, we escorted a painting across a city that pretended to be asleep. The canvas had been corrected for the third time and was being moved to a chapel that knew how to love obedience. We carried it like a stretcher. The night carried us like an alibi. In the streetlight, the silver of our cloaks, dulled to the dignity of dusk, caught a shy gleam and let it go. The moon clock in my pocket decided to disdain both market and devotional, noon, and throbbed once with a private hour. The captain felt it through the fabric as if the time itself had coughed. "Do you hear it?" he asked. I nodded. "Good," he said. "We prefer soldiers who can hear." As a Crusade, we installed the painting. The priest made the sign. The choir exhaled. The ledger received its little circle. As we were leaving, a child in the second pew, no mirror trained for him, no catechism achieved, squinted, not in piety, but in that squint which is concentration pretending to be suspicion. He whispered to his mother, and I am almost certain I know the sentence. The light answered like a person. The mother hushed him with the practiced mercy of women who want their children to be welcome. We stepped into the courtyard. The fig tree lifted its leaves like a diagnosis, and Rome rehearsed its moon. You want the confession that ends a chapter. I will not stage the exit yet. That belongs to a later hour, when the clocks will refuse to agree, and I will stop asking them to try. What I will give you is the closest thing the Legion has to prayer. The line the captain spoke when the work threaded itself too tightly around his breath. May we choose the smallest violence that attains coherence. I hear it now as a warning, not a wish. In the mouth, it tastes like warm metal, like the hinge of a door that has learned to open both ways. The Legion believes itself to be kind. Perhaps that is the most exquisite cruelty, to be gentle while changing the weight of the world. I learned their keys. I learned their tones. I learned where lamps should fall and which saints mind their seasons. I learned to praise a name into another century and to love a sentence so softly it fell asleep. And then, because tenderness finally remembered what it was for, I learned to leave. The unraveling began with a door that opened the wrong way, and it ended, if endings can be trusted, inside a building that had never been built. They called it the Castle of Memory. Though no plan exists, no masonry survives, no pilgrim can climb its stair. I did not walk to it. It assembled around me, stone by stone, out of the instruments we had trained to behave. Chains, clocks, mirrors, maps, choirs, and the very politeness of corridors. Memory, when it becomes architecture, prefers the solid manners of castles. I should say how I entered. A summons arrived in a script that knew my bones. A small card, heavy as if carrying a coin no eye could see. Midnight. Theater of Confessions. I went because I still obeyed nouns with capital letters. The 7 clocks on the wall practiced their minor disagreements with a devotion that looked like honesty. The man whose posture belonged to a sword stood at the lectern and did a thing that instruments hate. He spoke without tone. "We have reached the edge of recurrence," he said, as if announcing weather. "A cluster of corrections are refusing adhesion. The moon clock thrums at unauthorized hours. A psalter will not cease pointing at person. A map insists on angels in lamplight. A reliquary confesses different weights. depending on whose grief is holding it. We will pacify, not annihilate. We will harmonize, not erase. He slid a folder across the polished wood. It was my handwriting again, crisp and traitorous. Authorization to enter the keep's lower annex without accompaniment. The notice was unsigned, which is to say, signed by everyone. A silver cloak stood at my shoulder, with a softness designed to be mistaken for mercy. He said, "Bring your notebook." He meant, bring the tool you use against yourself. We descended past the rooms that have names, past the hush room where vowels behave like weather, past the archive air that tastes of candle smoke and obedient mineral. The lamps hardened, the stairs learned to forgive my knees. The fig tree's memoried daylight freckles on leaves that have practiced benediction stayed upstairs, useless now. The guard at the last post wore the graphite like a blessing. He did not read my papers. He read the temperature of my hesitation and found it acceptable. The annex is a hallway designed by a conscience. No decoration, floors polished until lamps move. When you move, a reminder that you are never only where you think you are. The first door opened the wrong way again. Not outward, not inward, but toward a third option. A swing that suggested the building could be persuaded to pivot around your doubt. Beyond it, a room I recognized from training and nightmares. 7 listening stations. A glass case with the sword that has never drawn blood. A lectern shiny with the oil of uncountable hands. And on the far wall, not the 7 clocks, but a single face of blackened silver. The Eclipse Clock. It has no numbers. It does not tick. It waits like a closed eye. The man with the sword posture gestured, and the room rearranged its silence to make room for God. "Before we intervene," he said, "we catalog. Before we catalog, we confess." He looked at me, as a doctor looks at the part of the body where you think the pain lives. Begin. I had never confessed without a booth. The Legion does not care for furniture that allows privacy to pretend it is intimacy. I spoke in the register that lives beneath obedience, the one you save for winter. I recounted the chapel whose halos would not sleep. My diagram of tilting lamps, the third measure voweling of tone theta that made pigment agree to be tired. I described the reliquary that weighed grief differently, depending on the surname that held it, the numbers that chose equality only when sung toward. I specified the page of the psalter where the hares point with their adorable treason at person and the official line that prefers providence. I admitted the substitution I had crafted in Prague that taught a woman to become rumor inside her own witness. I said the sentence out loud, the one that tastes like coins in the mouth. The room listened the way a ledger listens responsibly without affection. When I finished, the Eclipse Clock moved. Not a tick, not a chime. The air changed pressure, like a building swallowing. The man nodded once, as if to himself. "You hear," he said to me, and it wasn't praise. The castle of memory assembled at the edge of the lectern. A corridor widened from the wall, as if an architect had just remembered a plan. We walked into it because we lacked imagination to do otherwise. Doors appeared without choosing a side. The ceiling lowered respectfully. The floor shone with that waxed obedience that teaches you to watch your own walking. The first chamber was a library whose shelves carried the weight of names gently retired. Saints praised into docility. Popes aligned into staircases. Scholars escorted into editions where their certainty would be tired out by footnotes. The spines exhaled beeswax, and a note like a hum. The second chamber was cartography. The vellum globe stood on its brass gallows, seas polished bright by the fingerprints of centuries that believe travel is a vocation. The seam along the latitude, the healed wound glimmered under the room's careful lighting. Small, furious annotations, the monk's handwriting like a held breath, insisted, "Here the angel descends in lamplight. Here the sea forgets its name." The captain carried a brush that could move pigment without insult. A monk's mercy mechanized and tried to coax the inlet into allegory. The brush came away blue. The inlet stayed luminous, as if backlit by a decision. Tone delta, someone suggested. Hopeful and architecture we reserve for stubborn maps. Not yet, the captain said. We must attempt courtesy first. He tilted a lamp. The coastline practiced humility. The angel persisted. I pressed my ear to the vellum without being ordered. It hummed, like a wine glass taught to sing by a finger. The chest hummed with it. The moon clock in my pocket thrummed a private noon that made me ashamed to be carrying hours. We moved on. The chamber of chains was next. Books anchored by iron rested with the dignity of oaths. The chain is not punishment, Sister Ordinary Face had said. It is the grammar of keeping. And yet, each chain sang a different pitch of custody. A ledger, yes. The ledger that had never existed, and stubbornly insisted it did lay open to the column labeled corrections. The ink line that divided guilt from mercy wavered as if the paper were remembering a hand that hesitated. I touched a link. It warmed, as if acknowledging the pulse of an object that knows people better than we know ourselves. Do not unfasten, the captain said. Not because he suspected me, but because the room had begun to feel greedy. We came to a gallery of mirrors, not the project of mirrors I have complained about in these chapters. A lacquered obedience that shows each audience the scene that keeps them tame, but other mirrors, older, less trained. They did not change what they reflected. They changed the posture of those who looked. A legionnaire with graphite on his cuffs stood before one and straightened. A sandman stood before another, and his chainless wrist twitched as if missing its small ritual. I took my place and saw, not my face, but the ledger's columns written on skin. Recurrence, tonality, resistance, pacification, and a blank column named cost. That last column is not in the books, because it cannot be written down without making the walls raise their eyebrows. The mirror made it visible, which is unforgivable. The castle's core was the choir chamber. The 7 singers stood behind a screen of wood, carved into lilies that had learned to be stern. Loops at their wrists, the chains slack, ceremonial, gentle in their promise that voices belong to pages glinted like well-behaved rain. The captain lifted a hand, and the vowel that launders insistence into sleep rose careful as fog. The air agreed to be softer. The instruments of our various mercies arranged themselves into a chord. Now, he said, the chapel. The wall obeyed by becoming a chapel. Stone learned paint. Paint learned saints. The fresco that had resurrected itself 3 times already faced us, like a woman standing uninvited in a doorway, unwilling to pretend she had knocked. Halos hovered above heads with the quiet stamina of the moon. A parish priest, an actor perhaps, or a memory recruited for demonstration, wrung his hands with gratitude rehearsed into guilt. The captain counted steps from door to altar and wrote the number on his palm. Numbers, the legion's honest prayer. Lamps, he said. and we tilted the fixtures to teach the shadows new manners. The saints blurred obligingly at the edges. One refused, the widow with the gaze like a ledger that will not close. Tone theta at the third measure, he said, and the vowel learned the key that tastes like sleep. The paint settled with a sigh like wet parchment, choosing a flatness it can live with. Then the widow looked at me. Do not argue with me about paint and eyes and the dementia of a man who has slept too little in rooms where the air is taught to break. The widow looked at me, and the halo above her head lifted like a ring someone had dropped into water, and now miraculously reaches for the surface. Her mouth did not move, but the line formed in the gallery of my skull. The light answered like a person. The hares had written it in their marginal politic. The psalter had pointed. The child in the pew had whispered it to a mother trained to hush love into safety. The widow said it with her eyes, and my name, both of my names, remembered what it was for. The Eclipse Clock sighed. The castle, like a building that is also a throat, swallowed twice. Again, the captain said, and the choir breathed tone theta with more architecture. The fresco exhaled obedience. The widow did not. The captain's mouth became the shape of a cancelled root. Tone L, he said, and the vowel brightened to that thin blade we use not to sleep but to reveal. The chapel's air went brittle. The gilding at the edges of frames looked ashamed of its own wealth. The halo over the widow's head did not shrink. It changed temperature. Tone omega, he said, and now the vowel behaved like doctrine. The room, obedient by training, bowed its neck. Paint is a lung. We taught it a different oxygen. The saint's eyes lowered into a proper decorum, except the widow's, which lifted, which insisted. The man with the sword posture put one finger on the lectern as if asking a child to count to one. We will pacify, he said softly. To the fresco or to me, I do not know. We will harmonize. He turned to me. Tilt the lamp 4 degrees, the lower right. I did as ordered. When the light shifted, the halo over the widow's head touched the edge of the frame and rang. Not audibly, I felt it run through the enamel of my teeth. It is not a poetic sentence to say that light has timbre. The moon clock in my pocket answered with a private noon that belonged to nobody's market and nobody's prayer. The 7 clocks in the theater upstairs disagreed so violently that their discord felt like a choice. The mirror in the gallery showed me the blank column labeled "Cost Fill" with ink. Stop, I said, to my hand, to the lamp, to the vowel, to the castle, to the man who thinks nations are made of memory and churches of useful truths. Stop. It is the least theological prayer and the only one that tries to keep love from being domesticated. No one moved. We prefer procedural courage to personal disobedience. The choir released tone theta with an extra ounce of mercy, and the paint behaved. The halo sobered. The widow found her century again. The parish priest cried grateful tears that made me want to apologize to Rain. The captain lifted his chin 1 degree and let the room return to its decorum. In the ledger somewhere, a circle was drawn, the bureaucracy of a halo done with pencil. We turned from the chapel to the reliquary, because in the castle your work follows you like a dog that has learned to open doors. The sliver of bone, or the wood that had practiced being bone until it passed, lay on felt with the dignity of something that has allowed itself to be owned. The family whose grief changes weight was there, or their shadows were. We sang bright tone, the revealing one, and the numbers tried to equalize. The figures held for a breath, a paragraph, a workable generation. Then they tilted, first by a whisper, then by an accent. The reliquary confessed bias. The building looked bored. The project of mirrors waited in the next chamber with its lacquered patience. We tested it, as we always do, with two bodies who have been trained to represent two audiences. A believer whose devotion is competent, a skeptic whose scholarship is affectionate. The mirror gave the believer comfort and the skeptic consistency. Both came away feeling less lonely. It is difficult to hate an instrument that performs charity so well. The questioner, who is either an invention of conscience or a janitor with genius, stood at the edge of the room and asked his inaudible question, "For whom is the mercy?" Perhaps it would have ended with our tidy violences, tilted lamps, trained vowels, a diagram of obedience had the psalter not escaped its chain. I do not mean the book ran. I mean the sentence slipped its binding. The hares pointed at person from 1,000 miles away, and the fresco's widow learned the word without anyone teaching her. The ledger's column, labeled corrections, coughed. The moon clock insisted on a noon that belonged to no one's authority. The eclipse clock, dear God, moved of its own will. The room swallowed again. A reflex you cannot call audible, but that makes the hair on your arms decide it belongs to a different animal. The man with the sword posture, who does not carry swords, took his hand off the lectern as if it had grown too warm. "Pacify," he said. "Not to us, but to the theory that gives him sleep." I did the unprofessional thing. I walked to the glass case and opened it. The sword that has never drawn blood lay in its velvet bed, with the serenity of objects that remember us longer than we remember them. I did not lift it to threaten or to dramatize. I lifted the scabbard and put it to my face. Frankincense, wood polish, childhood church at dusk. I heard a choir whose tone had never been catalogued, neither theta nor L nor omega, something like a vowel with edges, something like a name being spoken for the first time since it was hidden. I turned to the captain, to the choir, to the man who believes in memory as currency, and to the castle that believes in itself. "You cannot pacify a person," I said. "And I didn't mean the widow in the fresco. You can only imprison them, praise them into the wrong century, sing them into sleep, train a mirror to reflect the version that won't riot. But a person is not a century, not a page, not a noon. A person resists." "Truth resists," he corrected with a teacher's fatigue. "No," I said, and heard the key in my pocket, remembering my palm for the first time since I left. "Truth is turbulent. You've trained me to say it. People resist. We come back." The eclipse clock answered with that shift of pressure that bruises the inner ear. The choir's chains rattled once, the polite note of custody. The fresco did not bloom insurrection. The reliquary did not hurl itself from the table. The mirrors did not confess their lacquer. The castle of memory is too disciplined for spectacle. Instead, a small thing occurred. The kind of smallness that makes seismographs draw long, elegant lines. No one reads until after the city falls. The 7 clocks in the theater of confessions agreed for a whole minute. They agreed so hard the room forgot how to argue. Agreement is not always harmony. Sometimes it is stunned quiet. The captain lowered his hand. "We are done for tonight," he said. "We will return tomorrow with the proper permissions." Permissions. The most dangerous sacraments are printed and initialed. He dismissed the choir. He dismissed the family with the weighted grief. He dismissed the parish priest, whose tears deserved a better doctrine. He nodded to the man whose posture is a blade. He did not dismiss me. He waited with a courtesy learned from predators. "Walk with me," he said. We passed back through the chambers the castle had taught into existence. Mirrors that encourage audiences to domesticate themselves, chains that hum the grammar of keeping, maps that insist on saints plunged into lamplight, shelves that carry names gently retired. We arrived at a door that had the shyness of choices. It opened neither in nor out, but toward that third space where doors go when they want to reveal that hinges were always the tyrants. On the other side, a small, plain office with a desk built to survive a siege of paperwork. On the desk, a single sheet with a place for a signature. The handwriting was the same confident, unbeautiful script that titled De Vacuo Saeculo on the empty century. The sentence was short. Authorization to pacify recurrence by any tone necessary. The tidy cruelty of any hides itself by gratitude for necessary. He offered me a pen whose weight I recognized from a century I had not lived. My hand reached because hands love obedience. I thought of the child's homework, the teacher's smile, the graphite mouth curved like a chain. History is when the grown-ups pick one story so the kids won't get scared. I thought of the widow's eyes pronouncing person. I thought of the psalter's hares insisting with their tiny paws. I thought of the moon clock's private noons and the fig tree's leaves practicing the blessing until they get it wrong beautifully. I put the pen down. I resign, I said. We do not have that word in the Legion. We have transfer, sabbatical, reassignment to a quieter instrument. We do not have leave. It sounded like the hinge of a door learning a new prayer. He looked at me with the precise sadness of a man who has named many kinds of defeat and filed them properly. You cannot resign from what you remember, he said. You can only stop agreeing. Then I will stop agreeing. He nodded. It was not magnanimity. It was calculation. The ledger will list you as a variance, he said. You will be handled by praise. He meant, they will describe me so gently, I will not be visible. A benevolent footnote, a scholar whose testimony is valued but contextually limited, a priest who remembered in the wrong key. Praise me into a century that cannot use me, I said, and the sentence scared me with its accuracy. He opened the door that was neither inward nor outward but toward, and I stepped back into the corridor where the lamps adopt people into their reflections. I did not run. You cannot sprint through a grammar. I walked until the building remembered it had a front. Rome, performing night like an old musician who knows his audience by perfume, received me with scooters and bottle glass, and cats, rearranging dark. The moon clock in my pocket decided to be silent about its private noon. The key which I had not thrown into the river because keys know how to come back warmed, as if ready to be used for something else. The castle of memory did not collapse behind me. Castles do not collapse when a servant remembers his own name. They wait, they add a stair. They acquire a new chamber in which to display a portrait titled Dissenter, beloved by the wrong century. They file, they dust, they hum. I am meant to end this chapter with a spectacle. Alarms, sprinting, a city waking to a moon that chooses a different hour, a choir defecting with consonants. But the climax, in rooms like these, is a pen placed gently back in its tray. The climax is a signature withheld. The climax is a man who has learned to hear ink, discover that his mouth is also a document, and refuses correction. When I reached my room, the one the church lent me in a building that owns more doors than nouns. I set the key on the table and watched the halo of heat fade. I took the cloak from the chair and shook the graphite from it into my hands. Ash filled my lifelines. Ash made a map. The fig tree on the landing, asleep in its own patience, produced a small sound as leaves sometimes do when they dream of wind. I wrote one sentence in my notebook, then crossed it, then wrote it again. The most dangerous thing to them is memory returning. The clocks in the theater agreed for a minute, then disagreed. The widow waited in her century with her eyes practicing person until someone can afford to hear it. The psalter's hares are pointing still. The reliquary weighs grief honestly when no one watches. The moon clock keeps time by a sky not yet legislated. The castle of memory, very far beneath and also inside everyone who prefers coherence to truth, closes an invisible door carefully and waits for morning. I slept, not well, but without tone. I have given you corridors and clocks, maps with hums, chains that sing custody, choirs that launder insistence into sleep. I have given you a castle that builds itself out of instruments and a door that refuses to remember which way it ought to open. I have described the legion with the tenderness that a traitor owes to his teachers. Now I will do the plain thing. I will tell you how to walk out and what to carry. First, the confession that does not want a booth. I did not leave because I became brave. Bravery is a costume the story puts on the moment after you survive. I left because something inside me became unhousebroken, a small animal that refused to be domesticated by oaths and decent paper. When the captain offered me the pen and the tidy cruelty of any tone necessary, that animal bit the leash. When I woke the next morning in a room that had learned my nights by smell, I expected the world to punish me with spectacle. It did not. The world is more efficient than that. No alarms, no sprinting graphite, no choir defecting with consonants. Instead, the punishment was administrative, the soft erasure called praise. Friends did not vanish. Their voices acquired ceremonial distance. My name developed an adjective gifted, but contextually limited. My work was thanked into the wrong century. That is how this begins for you, if it ever must. Not with a gate slammed, but with a tone lowered, with compliments so careful they function as gloves. I packed a bag that could pass as an afternoon, paper that knew how to keep quiet, a pencil sharpened to a threat, a moon clock that refused every noon, the key that had decided not to drown. I kept one relic, not a bone or a splinter of mercy, but the leaf from the fig tree on the landing, dried to the shape of a listening ear. I did not take my cloak. Without graphite, it gleamed indecently. Shame is a uniform I no longer wear. Rome performed mourning like an elderly tenor practicing scales. Milk doors, courtyard voices, cats with decisions. I walked until I found the river, which looked, as always, like a length of black silk being drawn through a fist. I put the moon clock on the stone parapet and asked it for an hour. It hummed a private answer. You cannot live by private noon forever. You can use it to set your breath. You are waiting, perhaps, for instructions. I will not give you a manifesto. Manifestos go brittle and are used as rulers to slap knuckles. I will give you a practice, the only prayer the Legion ever taught me that I can recommend. Practice 1. Count to 7. In the dark, before the story climbs onto your chest and begins to purr its lullaby, Count your breaths until 7. Notice which breath arrives early, which arrives late. That is how edited time sounds acquire of adjacent minutes. If the breath that arrives early is always the 3rd, consider what your life has been trained to hurry past. If the breath that arrives late is always the 6th, consider what your life has been trained to defer. Practice 2. Weigh. Weight is testimony. If a narrative grows lighter in your hand the moment it is harmonized, ask what was lifted out of it. If it grows heavier when a certain surname touches it, ask whose grief is being priced. A reliquary bone or wood pretending to be bone taught me that gravity is the conscience of matter. You need no instrument but patience. Practice 3. Tilt the lamp. Do not add light. Change the angle. Shadows will confess more readily than strokes. When a painting, politics, scripture, family myth behaves, tilt the lamp 4 degrees and wait for the ring you feel in your teeth. If there is none, you have adjusted brightness, not angle. The ring is how a halo proves it was never paint. Practice 4. Refuse to be the audience that supplies the veracity. Mirrors trained for you will do their work. Do yours. Move your body. Change distance. Alter your face. Ask the mirror to earn your agreement. If the scene changes to keep you docile, you are not learning. You are being fitted for praise. Practice 5. Name the chain. When something is chained in your world, an idea, a book, a person, ask whether the chain is a promise or a punishment. It can be both. Say out loud which it is today. Put the date on the sentence. Chains are honest if someone is willing to speak their grammar. I wish I could hand you the psalter and the hares with their adorable treason. I cannot. What I can hand you is a sentence that keeps growing teeth in my mouth. The light answered like a person. Do not sentimentalize it. Do not put doves on it. When the light in your life starts behaving like intelligence, when coincidence develops posture, when timing acquires ethics, ask who is being pacified and why. You are a person. You are not a century. I will tell you what happened to the castle of memory after I left, because rumor is a kind of weather and I have learned to read clouds. It did not collapse. Castles do not die when servants resign. The Eclipse Clock still waits like a closed eye. The Legion still rubs ash into silver. The choir still rehearses tone theta to coax murals into decorum. Binders still praise names into harmless centuries. Sandmen still hum vowels that teach insistence to tire. The project of mirrors still offers comfort to believers and consistency to skeptics. The ledger still draws tidy circles that look like halos demoted to paperwork. But the hares keep pointing. Children keep squinting in pews and whispering to mothers, trained to hush love with kindness. In archives where a page once accepted correction with relief, the paper coughs before consenting. In galleries where the mirror's lacquer knows how to handle an audience, a fingerprint remains and refuses to evaporate. The moon clock still has its private hours. It keeps them like a fox keeps paths. The fig tree on the landing drops a leaf shaped like an ear into the courtyard, a reminder that listening is a form. And some of us variants, footnote, dissenter, beloved by the wrong century, carry notebooks where the column labeled cost is not blank. I began leaving small instructions for strangers in places the Legion considers beneath notice. On the back of a bus ticket, when calendars shift, ask whose hand moved them. Inside, a returned library book. If a saint is renamed, ask who profits. On a church bulletin, folded like a bird, Praise can be a weapon. Measure the bruises it hides. In a museum guest book, refuse to let mirrors choose your face for you. These are not heroics. They are the opposite of a campaign. They are mending, one stitch through a fabric that was cut to flatter a body that never needed clothes. I am not calling you to war. I am calling you to wakefulness. A warning. Wakefulness has manners. Do not become the thing you oppose. The Legion's sin is not that it loves harmony. Harmony is a mercy. The sin is forgetting the for whom. The questioner's whisper remains the only honest rubric. Before you accept a correction, breathe the sentence, "For whom is this mercy?" If the answer is, "For the ledger," refuse. If the answer is, "For the frightened," offer your shoulder and change the world with gentleness. A bureaucracy cannot learn. Another warning. Do not try to burn the castle. Fire is a language the castle speaks better than you. Instead, open windows in the rooms you can afford to ventilate. Teach children what questions cost, and pay the price yourself first. Write dates on your doubt. Carry a lunar calendar long enough that your body begins to remember the sky without being asked. When someone tells you, with kindness and citations, that a century is empty, say, "Empty for whom?" Then listen. The listening is the key. The key always stays warm. You will want a closing confession, so I will give you 3. 1. I still love the people who work in those rooms. I love their wrists, stained with walnut ink, their jokes about commas, the way they stand up straighter when an old page agrees to be read without cracking. Love does not absolve. It ties you to the work of changing the air without smothering the lung. 2. I keep the cloak. I said I did not. I lied. It is folded in a drawer, silver dulled by ash I can no longer wash from my hands. I take it out sometimes and let it lie across the bed, like a tide I survived. I do not put it on. I am careful with relics that remember me longer than I deserve. 3. I dream of the widow in the fresco eyes, like a ledger that refuses to close, pronouncing person without moving her mouth. I wake with my teeth ringing. I count to 7. The 3rd breath arrives early. The 6th arrives late. I do not correct them. I learn their names. If the story has helped you sleep, I hope the sleep was honest, not the kind padded by vowels that make history nap obediently. If the story has kept you awake, I hope the wakefulness is gentle, like a hand on a shoulder asking you to step outside and look at the moon for a minute. The sky will not collapse because you observed it without permission. It has carried worse. Here is the call, then, simple as a borrowed pen. Do not stop asking questions. The most dangerous thing to them is memory returning. Ask in public, so the air must answer. Ask in private, so your bones learn the grammar. Ask kindly, so no child has to grow up believing history is what the grown-ups pick so the kids won't get scared. Ask even when your voice shakes, because shaking is how a chain tells the truth about its weight. Write dates. Keep notebooks. Teach your hands to weigh. Tilt lamps by 4 degrees. Refuse to be the audience that supplies the veracity. When the door opens the wrong way, do not flinch. Doors are tyrants only when we forget they are furniture. When a mirror comforts you perfectly, move your face. When a map hums, press your ear to it and hum back until the seam admits it is a scar, not a border. Remember that silence can be holy, but it is also a tool. In the wrong hands, it becomes a lock. Silence wasn't sacred, it was enforced. Speak softly then, not to shout past silence, but to teach it new work. This is not a crusade. This is a shadow turned inside out. This is a choir discovering consonants. This is the moon clock, lending you its private noon long enough to make one stubborn phone call, to write one letter with a date that refuses to move, to return one book with a page dog-eared where a saint learned to be person again. If you must carry a relic, let it be a leaf shaped like a listening ear. If you must swear an oath, let it be this: I will choose the smallest violence that attains truth, and I will count its cost where ledgers refuse. If you need a password between those of us who have walked the polite stairs and those who tremble at doors, make it a child's sentence rescued from a homework margin and kept alive on the tongue. The light answered like a person. Now, before we go, breathe with me. Count to 7. Early, late, honest. Put the questions on the table between us like warm keys. Let the room grow quiet, but not obedient. When the clock in your house skips a beat, as all honest clocks do, do not apologize for it. Forgive it, and then ask who taught it to lie. Set it gently by the moon. And when morning performs itself again, with milk doors and courtyard voices and cats rearranging dark, carry the torch low. Shade it with your palm where wind is unfriendly. Pass it on without ceremony. Remember the sentence. Repeat it to the person who needs it more than you. Do not stop asking. Let memory return.